Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
There were members of the class who tried to correspond with me via email this week to ask me questions. And on Tuesday evening, I discovered from the Vanderbilt security office that my email was hacked, along with 18 other people. And I was working on this lecture for today, and my computer suddenly stopped and went blank. I lost access to the internet, to all of the applications that define my vocation at Vanderbilt. And my phone rang at the time that it went blank to tell me that I had been hacked and they were disabling all of my accounts and access to every application. It took 4 days for my account to be re-enabled, and that involved my having to be photographed with my ID in front of me and changing a password. The hackers were so devious, they actually went into my account to where the rules are prescribed for what I can and cannot do, and they changed all of the rules whereby every email that someone sent me, it went into a deleted file. When I tried to reply, I would get a message that this was undeliverable. So it took 4 days to resolve this, but finally, I received an email from Kathy and from Bob O'Gorman, and I want to begin today by addressing those correspondences. And it's not that I was ignoring you, it's just that I was being held hostage in cyberspace. Kathy writes that this year's Pulitzer Prize for Fiction was awarded to 2 books, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver and Trust by Herman Diaz. And she writes that Kingsolver's novel is about a boy who is put in what would be considered a disgraceful foster setting, whereas last week we were discussing the actual graces that occur in the fosterage of the unnamed protagonist in the novel. And Kathy writes, and I quote, "When I started my career, foster care was touted as the place for safety, nourishment, and love, which is what fostering in its real etymological context means. We all know that this was just a slogan in the U.S. Really enjoyed the presentation." So, Kathy, I wanted to acknowledge your correspondence. Bob O'Gorman wrote, and although I don't think Bob is here today, I'm still going to acknowledge this. Okay, and also this, Kathy, you might be interested in this as well, because you do, by virtue of having Irish heritage, have dual citizenship. So Bob had asked me about how reading this novel as one in the current century in English, but also who has Irish heritage, how this prose follows upon the ear of someone that is perhaps of Irish heritage. Is there something that is lost in writing in formal prose in English when it's really about the Gaelic voice? And I've thought about that. Is there something really lost from the eye to the ear? And that might be explained by how when Oliver Cromwell led the British troops against the Irish Catholics, and Ireland becomes completely colonized by the English, what else is colonized is also the Gaelic tongue. And among the restrictions that were placed by Cromwell upon this now British colony was there could be no musical instruments. So the historians of folk music argue that because the musical instruments were banned, that the tradition in music had to be conveyed only orally, a cappella, and how there is what we call in the Irish dialect that lilting of the voice. And so I'll repeat that for Bob, but I'll also tell you when I was studying in Europe and I was at the British Museum, there was a bust of Oliver Cromwell. And this was before the internet, when you could get digital images by the stroke of a key. But given my relationship to cyberspace, I'm not sure I could do that today. But nonetheless, I was taking a photograph of the bust of Cromwell, and one of the security guards was observing how closely I was making this photograph for educational purposes. And he said, why are you taking a photograph of that dreadful sod? So, I imagine he was of Irish extraction himself. So, we have in our weeks together experienced as a literary theological exercise Claire Keegan's writing, which may be described as a study in quietude and a study in controlled revelation. She, as we know, revels in the suspense of the unspoken. Her prose may be described as the held breath. It is a tacit nuance. And yet the structure, the architecture on which she has composed this narrative is a rather modest scale. It's a rather crystalline structure. We begin with the ride to the Kinsella's home. We end with the return to her biological parents' home. But what begins on the first page, we end at the very final scene. But what I find interesting is, if we consider what is the orthodox architecture for composing a work of art, there are the 5 different movements. We begin with the exposition. And then there are circumstances that are introduced that result in this growth in the plot, and usually a complicated plot. It's the design of a triangle. And then we reach that moment at the apex, the turning point, the climacteric. And then there is the falling action, the denouement, and then at the other base of the pyramid, there is the resolution. Keegan resists such a carefully plotted design, does she not? All of the different movements that I've just described are interwoven. All of this is told, as we know, from the perspective of an unnamed young girl in the historical present tense. And so by virtue of this sustained historical present tense and not lapsing into the past, it's very difficult to have these definite markers among those 5 movements. They're beautifully, intricately interwoven. The turning point, we could argue, is perhaps when she decides that she wants to continue holding the hand of John. And we have such complications as the intrusion of Mildred that intensifies the complications. And then the denouement is one that I would argue is very rushed when she returns home and then runs to John. But we do not end this, do we, with a very carefully resolution. We're left in what is known as the liminal space. And we know from our study of small things like these how thresholds and doors figure so very prominently in the school of imagery within that novella. And again, I think we could argue in Foster that it really becomes a study in liminal space, which is that space on either side of a threshold. We end with the young girl returning home, crossing the threshold back into her home, and this sense of displacement that she experiences. Her sisters look at her as though she is an English cousin. And the setting in which she finds herself, the tile on the floor is not clean. There isn't running water as in Edna's kitchen. It is the complete opposite, the antithesis of what she experiences once she crosses the threshold into Edna and John's home. But this idea of the novel being a study in liminal space, having to negotiate the different thresholds, crossing into one that at the end that we know is not going to be receptive to the education that she has experienced up to this point. But what we can infer, Carol, is that when she does cross over the threshold back into the biological family's setting, whereas she doesn't feel comfortable or received, she's not flinching as she has previously throughout the narrative itself. She returns educated. in the classical sense of the word educated, edukare, to go forth. She goes forth into this house, but she goes into it changed, what we discussed last week as having developed a power of comparison. And if I were to write a curriculum for the education of the unnamed protagonist, it would be a curriculum that begins in sensory experience, that then evolves into comparing and contrasting lived experiences, and then arriving at the idea that John imparts to her in one of the lessons, that you do not have to speak and tell all that you know, that you do have the right not to disclose. You have a right to reserve information. She learns that by virtue of the experience with Mildred, who wants to inquire about whether or not Edna uses margarine or butter in pastry. Do they drink at night? I mean, all of these questions, this barrage of these staccato questions that just surround the young girl, and then John's explanation that you don't have to tell everything you know. And she has an opportunity in the end to withhold that information. That drive up the lane could be one in which they were going to tell the parents that the daughter had drowned. But instead, they give her an invitation to come back. But that ride home could be one that could have had a tragic ending as well. The woman, Edna, who is always referred to as the woman by the unnamed protagonist, is in the front seat weeping, intensely weeping. And I think what we could argue is she's weeping because, yes, she has been predeceased by her own son, a grief that will never be relegated to the past tense. She's also perhaps weeping because she is relieved that the young girl did not drown. Perhaps she's also weeping because this is another absence, another loss. It's wonderfully, wonderfully lacking in a sense of resolution, certainly. But what the young girl puts into practice as she crosses into the home is exercising her right not to disclose that she almost drowned, and that the reason she is sneezing is from the chill, that she just took a chill, not from the effects of the cold weather. So liminal space, an education in liminal space, it's navigating different sides of the doorway and how one acts on either side. Questions or comments or observations? You've taken a vow of silence on me. Hi, Maureen. Well, as I said in my opening comment, if I were to write a curriculum of the pedagogy within this novella, I would begin with the sensory education of the unnamed protagonist, especially her education in touch, in the tactile. She is, as we know, a remarkably perceptive observer. And to Keegan's credit as a writer, she has not simply defaulted into the precociousness of a young child. Instead, in drawing her character, she is, again, I use the word navigating, her very sensitive observational skills. But at the same time, it's not just precociousness. There is a naivete, but at the same time, Andy, there is the experience of comparison and contrast that is developing with each day in the life of the Kinsella home. It's not just that, it's insufficient, it's inadequate to simply say that she's precocious as an observer. She is observing. But it's an observation that is more than just a mere glancing allusion. It is an observation that she then locates in a previous experience, and we see that power of comparison and contrast developing within her. She and Edna walk into the field to get the water, and she noticed the Frisian cows, and she hears them pulling the grass out of the earth as they begin to chew. And what we hear in that observation is she's so sensitive to her environment, but at the same time, she's able to speak figuratively, in comparison, in contrast, in simile, and in metaphor. She has, I think, all of the attributes of a young poet in the making. And Martha, the point that you made, I think, is quite legitimate in encountering this text. Because the diction is so simple, because the architecture is so crystalline, one has to encounter this novel repeatedly as if one were reading a long modern poem in which every syllable breathes, every syllable pulses, and does not deprive the next one of the oxygen that it requires. So it's very much like entering into a modern poem, and every detail is important. Questions, observations now at this interval?
So you said
yes,
this power of observation,
yes,
the comparison, contrast, and it makes me feel like this is transformational.
Yes.
The way she looks at things, there is a transformation happening within her at almost every moment. It's very vibrant.
Yes. So consider, Beth, what she brings to the Kinsella home in terms of the experiences in her heretofore education. It's a very provincial education. It's quite parochial. It is a world in which the adults have the voice. And we also know that she is very accustomed to hearing what the adults say, and she also notices their gesture, how they will kick with the sole of their shoe a divot out of the earth, how they will slap the top of the car when it's time to go. So not only does she hear their voices, she sees the gestures that accompany the voice. And yes, it is transformational. What she brings is parochial. It's very provincial. It's limited. And now that then is all challenged. Once she crosses the threshold into this other liminal space, everything becomes the foundation for comparing and contrasting. In the Kinsella home, they play cards. Among the guests that come to the home is one who brays like a donkey, and they can't sleep. And Edna even allows her to rise from her slumber and come down to meet the ass Casey, who is making the noise like the donkey. So it really becomes an education in textures, in colors, in sound. It's an education that embraces her entire sensory faculty, which then translates into her rational faculty by way of comparison and contrast, whereby she then arrives at an understanding that there are circumstances in life which have to be explicit, but there are also circumstances that may merely be implied. Yes?
I think it was a discussion about a home where Jews are being hidden during the Holocaust, and the Nazis come to the door and they say, "Are there any Jews here in this house?" And the person who answers says, no Jews. And the question is, did this person tell a lie? And was that, reprehensible? And the answer was that the Nazis were not entitled to the information.
Right. And so we can read this novel really as with the ethical question, is one ever justified in withholding the explicit truth? Well, yes, especially when the revelation of that truth is being given to someone who doesn't have the emotional capacity to understand it. Yes, it is justified. It is not a lie. They are not withholding the information of their son's tragedy out of shame. It's not a secret. I think what's really interesting for me as a reader is that it seems to be that Keegan, as rich as her vocabulary is, that she's also showing us the limitations that a writer has. Faulkner said of writing, his tool, words, that he could not have been given a clumsier, damnedest tool other than words. And I think what Keegan is really showing us here is that there are certain situations in which words prove to be inadequate. It's not a secret. The people of the town know this. And secret has the connotation of being shameful. But the reason that they are not telling her of this tragedy is, and let us not forget, it is their right to tell them. They are the parents. It is they who have been predeceased by their child. They have the right to deliver the narrative as they wish to deliver it. And it is not morally incumbent upon Mildred to disclose the truth and to refer to the young girl as adult and to make the observation, what kind of rock did they pull back to find you? But this violent intrusion upon the privacy of a family, their own private tragedy, it is they who have the right to control this narrative as they see fit. And they do not withhold this from her as some secret or some embarrassment. They withhold it because they know, as a parent perhaps would know, that this child is not at a stage in her development whereby she can receive the truth and understand this. Your hand was up as well, I believe, earlier. Yes.
I was going to, but I didn't want, are you finished with this talk? Because I want to.
It's fine. I will weave it in, I promise.
When you're talking about the sensory experience, the thought occurred to me how present she was. She was in the present moment, she could have been thinking about her home life, she could have, her parents, she could have been thinking a lot of things. And for a child to be present is really learning for us.
Yeah, this attention to the very moment and how she has such an incredible penetrating gaze. But every experience that happens to her is one that she heretofore has never experienced, especially in the matter of touch. As I said, her entire sensory faculty is engaged very intensely, quite profoundly. But the first of the senses that really registers upon her body, and this education is one that begins on her body, is with touch. That morning, as her mother is preparing for her to depart, she braids her hair very tightly. And she remembers the effects of the steel brush coming through her hair. Her mother also has pressed her garments. And what we infer from this careful attention that the mother, with these meager, limited means and resources, is doing is, consider this. This is a part, I think, of that sanctified imagination I was referring to last week, that the mother here is placed in the difficult posture whereby she has to foster her child. Her oldest daughter, whom we as readers know is not considered as one who could help around the house as her mother is caring to full term another child, but what we learn is that she is perceived by her father in synecdoche as being a mouth to feed. Her father refers to her in the second person, you. He tells her, don't fall in the fire, you, as that's his departing words to her. But the fact that as we go into this young girl's life, she's never known touch. But she remembers the touch of her mother, brushing her hair, pressing her clothes. Her mother realizes, in an effort to try to present her in a dignified way with the limited resource that they have. This allows us to infer that the mother here is really having to make a sacrifice and trying to present her daughter with dignity. And then, of course, you have the father's behavior, which is the antithesis of dignity. But the fact that the mother wants to present her not as a charity case, but with some semblance of dignity, the pressed clothes, the tightly braided hair, which by the end of the ride there has come unbraided, and she even says of herself that she looks like the wild daughter of a tinker as well. And as Edna looks at her, she realizes, yes, my dress is thin, my sandals are dusty, my hair is unbraided. But from the touch of her mother's hand, as she feels her mother's stomach against her while she's braiding her hair, we then move to the touch of Edna. The first gesture of Edna, before she crosses into that liminal space, Edna kisses her, comments that the last time she saw her was when she was in the pram, and the pram has become, in their limited resources, an improvised wheelbarrow and is broken. But she then takes her thumb and presses to her face to remove what perhaps is some foreign object or smudge. But she notes immediately how Edna's thumb is distinctly different from the thumb of her own mother. It's touch. It begins in the tactile. She then is given a bath and a scrubbing for the first time she's ever had a bath. And then she is vested, she is dressed in the clothes of the son, because the father, in saying, "Don't fall in the fire you," has driven away without leaving the suitcase. The touch of John's hand when they are walking onto the beach after John intercedes to try to explain the violence that Mildred has indeed rendered. She doesn't want to sustain the hand. She realizes her father has never held her hand. And she's fearful of sustaining that touch because she knows it can't be forever. But she does continue to hold his hand. But this, one of the recurring themes here that we find is touch and also hunger. And yes, the hunger here is certainly, in a literal sense, the limited means that the family has to feed. But I think metaphorically, the hunger, the greater famine is the lack of touch. Matt?
So I was thinking about the way in which they draw the protagonists into their own world and this idea of dignity and thresholds. In some ways, when she enters into their home, she's past a threshold. And then I love the way that she's drawn into their work, their common work, because the work itself is a threshold. In some ways, she's seen work in a certain way at home, and we might assume that it's very toilsome and there's a lot of drudgery. But here she notices that going through the motions with this family, there's something orderly and dignified, even though she might not be able to put it into words. I kept thinking of, there's a scene in John Steinbeck's novel East of Eden when one of the characters has there's a very traumatic moment in his life, and one of the other characters says, "Keep going through the motions." And it's always stood with me, is we need work to dignify our lives because we are surrounded on every side by grief and questions and uncertainties that we can't always put words to and that don't have a quick answer. And so we must go through the motions, and sometimes it's commonplace things. Often it is commonplace things. So there's that. And then I was also thinking of, one of the images that I found very evocative was the well. It's just a rich source of, I think for a child, but for anyone really, a well is such a place of encounter. It really is a threshold. And at first she has this trepidation about approaching it with, I guess, Miss Kinsella. And I was just thinking, a well both conjures dread because it's deep and because it's dark, but also sort of this excitement because you're peering almost through a telescope into this deep place. It's mysterious. So I was thinking of that and how, as this woman takes her hand and watches her, imitates her, she moves from a place of fear to embracing it, you know, and also there's, I guess, a biblical image in the well of marriage and nuptials, and I don't know if that plays on it at all, but certainly it's a place of enchantment. So I thought that was really beautiful.
And water is the element in which human life is conceived, and the gestation. It's an element of renewal of life, it's regenerative, but it's also the same element that can claim life as well. There's that duality that Keegan will not let us forget. As you say, it is a source of enchantment, it's a mystery, it has depths that are immeasurable, which is exciting, but at the same time it can prove tragic. Indeed. And so, and would you not say that Keegan as a writer allows herself to navigate relentlessly that tension between the attractive and the enchanting and the possible perilous as well. She locates herself in that as well. And as a result, she avoids the didactic, she avoids the sentimentality, she avoids becoming a Mildred.
And you stay on this verge of suspense.
Yes.
Without anything being said other than just plain words. And back to the sensual, the touch. I inferred, and you all may have talked about this the last couple of weeks, but I inferred that for the first time she was receiving true touches of love, of expressive love, and that perhaps she had gotten some battering before. I had a feeling that something had happened to her, something secret and bad, and perhaps physical abuse. I even thought maybe sexual, but it's all up to the reader to infer.
Well, that is a theme that Keegan does indeed employ in one of her stories, The Parting Gift. And the mother is an accomplice as well. And I think what's also noteworthy, if we're on the subject of the mother here, it's very difficult for us as readers. It would be very easy to typecast the young girl's parents. As we discussed last week, how has Dan become the person he has become? That scene that we looked at the table when his manners are so very crude, and how he knowingly does not use the proper instrument for the beats, and how everything begins to bleed into the ham and then with the cigarette. At the same time that the mother is aware that she wants to try to present her daughter with dignity, in the case of Dan, his pride has been hurt as well. If these parents make one wise decision, it is to whom they foster the child. To have to do that, undeniably, that requires a sense of sacrifice and maybe a compromise of one's pride, even Dan. And I think his behavior is more or less indicative of that's how he shows that his pride has been wounded by behaving as he does. But the mother, when I think of her, when we look at her life as we know it, we don't even know how many children she has had. But it's been one constant delivery after another, beyond the means which they have. Her mother has taken time to teach her the names of the herbs that she can still identify. But it's too easy, I think, to simply try to blame either parents for the failure of this young girl not being educated. It's complex. They have become this because of certain circumstances, not all of which that they could be held accountable. You have to think about Dan as a part of that succeeding generation of those who were affected by the blight and the famine of the potatoes. And of course, one of the reasons he gives for going back home is, earlier, excusing himself, he's got to spray the potatoes, to which Edna says, well, there's no fear of a blight this time. But the fact that comes to him, that perhaps that is like an antecedent somewhere in the back of his family's history, that he may have been affected by that fallout, and that perhaps that is one of the reasons he has become as he has. Again, Keegan leaves that to our imagination as well. But to her credit as a writer, these characters cannot be typecast. She has employed a very conventional trope, or an archetype, has she not, of the journey, of the Odyssey. But yet, within that trope, in that classical pattern, she does not follow that strict progressive line, certainly, as well. It's wonderfully, wonderfully complex. It's the composite narrative. You have, on the first page, the journey. It ends with the return home. As I said, it's a very linear architectural blueprint. But yet within that, we have all of these different flashbacks and scenes occurring in the imagination of the young girl. So you have all of these vignettes within this composite structural design. And that's how we learn how very sensitive and observant and imaginative she is, and how she is beginning to think in simile and in metaphor, and drawing these analogies as well. To use your term, the transformation of the young girl as well. Let's see, John, and then Fred, and then you, sir, after that. Remember that, because I won't be able to. Okay.
There's a line on page 19 that I keep reading over and over, because I think it captures everything that I love about Keegan's writing, and how this young girl really does, in sort of the childlike attentiveness that Mary Jo is talking about. There's not a lot of noise, but what there is that she sees what she sees, and she makes comparisons, but we never just compare one thing to another. We're always comparing things with respect to context or background or tone. And I think Keegan lets the background be just as ephemeral and murky as it is in fact, that is, as it is in experience, whereas maybe less skillful writers will always draw out too much meaning, right? Instead of letting things be, as we talked about the first week. So the line is this, it's in the middle of page 19 in my edition. And this is after their conversation about shame, and secrets, which is just marvelous. As soon as Edna says this, I realize she is just like everyone else, and wish I was back at home so that all the things I do not understand could be the same as they always are. The layers of comparison and contrast there, I keep coming back to this, because on the one hand, the young girl says, Edna is just like everyone else. So it would seem to be a very straightforward comparison. But then she wishes she was back at home, so then she makes another comparison. All the things I do not understand could be the same as they always are. So in this sort of background awareness, she's able to compare the things that she doesn't understand at home with the things that she doesn't understand in this new context. But because they're things she can't understand, all she can have is sort of a tacit awareness, just something more like a tone or a vibe or a sense. And because this isn't explicit, Keegan doesn't bother to put any more words around it. It's left to us to infer from our own experience what's going on. And there's so much about this novel like this, that it reaches for language, but when language can't do, she's content to say, we're not going to say anything. But that's not the same as not writing, right? It's not the same. It makes the silence. I think it's just marvelous.
Silence is one of the most salient properties in the setting of this novel. And silence takes on a rather anthropomorphic quality. There's this wonderful moment where the young girl says, the silence grows. And as a writer, Keegan is quite comfortable in allowing the silence to be a property or a particularity of the setting, and not feel that she has to explain it or to fill it with noise, so to speak. And the to your point also, when there are no words, and I think that works here on two levels, John, in that the young girl doesn't have that vocabulary, but at the same time, a writer cannot always have it either. And this one moment, it's related to touch. And when she's getting her bath, I put one foot through the steam and feel again the same hot scald. I keep my foot in the water, and then when I think I can't stand it any longer, my thinking changes, and I can. This water is deeper and hotter than any I have ever bathed in. Our mother bathes us in what little she can, and sometimes makes us share. After a while, I lie back and through the steam watch the woman as she scrubs my feet. The dirt under my nails she prizes out with tweezers. She squeezes shampoo from a plastic bottle, lathers my hair, and rinses the lather off. Then she makes me stand and soaps me all over with the cloth. Her hands are like my mother's hands, but there is something else in them too. Something I have never felt before and have no name for. I feel at such a loss for words, but this is a new place and new words are needed. Isn't that lovely? This is a new place. New words are needed. And as we've discussed before, the word that assumes primacy in her lexicon in the final scene is daddy. Not father, but the term of endearment. Her hands are like my mother's, but there is something else in them too that she cannot name. Fred, your hand was up.
Yeah, I was looking at these encounters with water, we kind of bookend the story of the bath at the start. They get into the bath, wash, clean, getting the clothes of the Netflix and the sun, and then pulled into a well, and we sort of go towards the end. To me, it seems to be pretty strong baptismal.
Yeah.
And if that's a fair read, it's instead of an overread, if you will. And I'm wondering, it seems to add then a completely different dimension to her journey.
Would you elaborate more on that last point you just made there?
So then it becomes almost a story then of spiritual redemption.
Yeah.
There's love, which is maybe even divine. We don't have words to describe.
Right.
Which is encounter. More than.
And in spite of this incredible transformative education from which she is graduated, she has to return into a setting characterized by the paradox of constant mutability. But she returns enlightened, less provincial, less parochial. And you, sir, your hand?
There was a real short observation at the beginning and a statement by the child at the end, kind of bookending that caught my eye right away. Multiple things you said this morning are giving it's really popping before me. Your comments, her girl's observation about the cows and about the playing cards, father's no dignity, her keen awareness and observation and such. And so she observes on the first page, repeats, actually says out loud, she observes internally, repeats out loud, I think at page 82 or 3, that's where my doll lost the red heifer.
Yes.
And the other thing that you said that really helps me with that is this is a poem.
It is.
So that statement right there just came alive for me with all these observations.
And that was an observation that Martha exchanged before class began. It is very much, I think, like entering into a modern poem, because the precision of this prose is as precise and as cogent as the genre of poetry demands. mean, each word breathes and does not in any way take the oxygen of the preceding or the succeeding word. It has a breath, it has a pulse. It's vibrant. But you know, the allusions are not ones that are in any way erudite. You know, Keegan really endows the young girl with the voice of a young girl and writes in the lexicon of this young girl with this provincial background. She's not, you know, Keegan, the restraint that she exercises in really giving the young girl a genuine voice. As I said earlier, Keegan says as a writer, she gets into the paragraphs. And it's as if she stays within the paragraph after paragraph and pays very close attention to the words that she gives to the voice of the young girl. She attributes her ability to write from the perspective of a child with herself having minded children growing up from her own experience. Her parents were farmers, but interestingly, she says of the books that they had in their house, there was a color illustrated version of the Bible, and we can certainly imagine what those images would be like, and there was a cookbook. She said she didn't have the resources as a child. Her parents were not living in any way in circumstances like the young girl's parents are, but there just were not books. And she said the great advantage in her own education of not having books, because she said she knew herself well enough that she would go around with her nose in a book all the time, that she had to develop her imagination. And I think, the education of Claire Keegan is an education in experience and imagining and comparing and contrast. And she somewhat continues that with this young girl as well. Other thoughts? Yes.
We have a situation here in Nashville where information is being withheld. The Covenant School tragedy, and so many people want this manifesto from the shooter to be disclosed. And other people, such as the parents of the children who were murdered, say no, maybe Nashville isn't mature enough to handle it.
Well, I think it begs the question, who has the right to deliver the narrative? You know, who has the right, and to just make this claim that one has the right to know, I would take issue with that as well. You know, it's what constitutes the right to know, and who has the right to tell. Those are questions that I think Keegan very much asks in relation to the, as I said, that violent intrusion on the part of Mildred as well. You know, it's not a secret. It's a tragedy. It's not a secret that is shameful. People know about it, and they've known it for so long that they have these lapses in memory. When the men come while they're playing cards, and the men come to ask for funding to put the roof on the school, they realize at asking John for money for the school that, well, his son's not in the school. And you see John's magnanimity, as opposed to allowing them to feel embarrassed or shamed. He speaks immediately and says, well, I may not have children there, but rain falls on other children as well. You know, that's John's, magnanimity and grace, if you will, that he manifests as well. So, yeah. How are we doing on time, John?
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay. I want to continue for a few minutes about the body, the washing of the body, the clothing of the body, the cleaning of the ears. As Edna says, you could plant a geranium in that. But beginning in the body and this cleansing, and then as it moves, touch, sight, hearing, and all of the senses, they begin to coalesce, and then arriving at a real understanding of the lesson that there aren't words for everything, that we have to depend upon implication, certainly. I wanted to close. This may seem somewhat of a digression, but it really isn't, because you'll recall last week I described what John does for the young girl, how he scores the soles of her shoes, how he takes her to town to purchase the clothes to be togged out, how he holds her hand and takes her for the first time for her to see the Atlantic. All of these lessons, which he does out of his magnanimity, could be described as offices of love. We think of the word office traditionally as a space, a room. We think of the office of the hours, little rooms of prayer throughout the day. And one of the strategies that I encourage my students at Vanderbilt to think as they are writing is to take words that are heretofore held into a sacred linguistic domain, but to bring them into the precinct and to incarnate them into lived experiences. And the poet Robert Hayden does that with his poem, Those Winter Sundays, which I've included at the end of today's handout, and how he, as a poet, takes the word, the office, an act of devotion and love. But these offices of love are not enacted in a sanctuary, but in a domestic setting. Rather providentially, Karen asked me at the beginning of class if I were familiar with this poem by Robert Hayden, and then I explained, well, I want to use it today as an example of how writers can indeed take words out of a heretofore sacred realm and bring them into the precinct, bring them into the secular, and to incarnate them in the lives of three-dimensional participants in the drama of existence. Robert Hayden taught at Fisk during his vocation, and he was also the first African American to be appointed to the Poet Laureateship, which in America is merely a position as a consultant to the Library of Congress. It doesn't have all the royal trappings that the Poet Laureate of England does. Those winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold, then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made bank fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So in honor of Juneteenth and the offices of love, I give you this poem. And yes, the speaker is now reflecting upon these acts that his father performed, making the room warm before he called him from his slumber, polishing his shoes. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? The greater question is, what could you have known at the young age when these offices were being given to you? What John does for the young girl are, I would argue, undeniable offices of love and devotion. He intercedes because he knows that there is perhaps a need without her having to ask or to even be, there's no explanation. He simply takes her hand, scores the shoes, and he does it quietly. And I think that's what we call grace. I think John and Edna are full of grace. Yeah. They're imaginative, they're inventive, they're generous, all that she has never before experienced.
They laugh.
They laugh. Yes.
I loved the laughter.
There is such buoyancy in this house. In spite of the tragedy that has occurred, they manage still to receive guests and to have recreation and fellowship, and they laugh. You know, there's that wonderful moment when Edna, out of his ear range and after he's gone, mocks Dan by saying, you know, that comment that he has made, well, 12 months from now, what do you think about it? She even mocks him after she has refused to even acknowledge him by turning her face to the kettle. But nonetheless, there's a buoyancy. And we think of water. You're going back, Matt, to what you were saying about the well. You know, there's a buoyancy within that household on which they are managing to survive and float in spite of what they have had to endure. What they have had to endure will all, you know, it's interesting that the young girl's narrative is told to us in the historical present tense. But this tragedy that has occurred in the past is still in the present tense. But there's still, they find a way to have merriment. And in spite of what has happened, we learn from John that Edna always tries to find the good in people, even in Mildred. You know, that the magnanimity that both of them really embody and represent, certainly.
It's humbling.
Yes, you know, and in Aristotelian ethics, magnanimity is the virtue that he celebrates, that greatness of self toward others. Comments, questions? Maureen?
I've been trying to figure out the significance of him having her run to the mailbox.
Yes.
And timing her.
Yes.
Other than the fact that in the end, she's able to run to him.
Yes. Well, it's a part of the education of the body in terms of her senses and for her, you know, to improve her speed to the mailbox. And you know, what's revealed, Maureen, in that scene is that he says, you know, continue to practice, discipline your body, and you'll be running like a reindeer and no man can catch you. To which she says she has learned from her mother, understandably, not to make yourself a present to a man. Yeah, you know, and see again, she's heard that. She has heard the men talking before they hit the top of the car to signal it's over. And you know, there's that wonderful moment when she's lying in bed before Edna comes and sleeps with her, when she feels the mattress sink and she knows that Edna has come to sleep with her. And Edna says to her, as she's bidding her good night, that you know, she could not understand why anyone would leave a child with strangers, which just again is an example, you know, in a very simple sentence of the depth of the loss. But I think what's important there is you know, John is training her body. Edna is helping her with her complexion with the Weetabix, you know. And it's like this education of body and mind, certainly. But I think the key point there, Maureen, is that she remembers what her mother has said. She also remembers, as she's in the bed with Edna, she's wondering, will my mother have a boy or a girl? And she knows that she really doesn't really want either. You know, she has that dream, Maureen, when she's recovering from the fever, that her mother is suspended in a tree. And I think, you know, what that suggests is that she understands that her mother is very suspended in terms of her mother having an independent will and agency, that her mother is very much suspended and cannot extricate herself from this. So, yeah. Yes, closing comment.
I'm picturing Kinsella training his son.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, the fostering here is multivalent, I argue. They're fostering her, and they are fostering her in the real sense of fostering, as in feeding her, feeding the hunger, you know, addressing this figurative famine, if you will. They are fostering her, they're feeding her, they're nourishing her, and at the same time, she's fostering them. I would argue as well, that she is a presence, a young presence in their lives. We know the depth of their grief because they have not in any way changed the room in which the son has slept. This is how Keegan allows us to infer without telling us the depth of the grief. And furthermore, back to your point, John, where are the words that are adequate that could actually describe that grief? There are no words. They're mere attempts. As Faulkner would say, they're just the damnedest, clumsiest tools around. But the fact that they have not changed the room, that they have kept his wardrobe, the fact that the wallpaper hasn't been changed, railroads, tracks that aren't going anywhere in terms of a destination, and a young boy detached waving in the background. Those details, seen through the eyes of the young girl, allow us to infer the depth of the grief and how removing the wallpaper, putting the clothes away, this is something that can't be relegated to the past. She shows us that, does she not? Comments? Questions? Sir? Yes.
Well, I mean, you're doing a beautiful job and I'm enjoying it. I think that, the most basic thing that we probably would learn in our life, maybe I did, was the sense that I might be of value, that I might have qualities instead of being a burden. Sometimes in life that I was born in a very large family and it was a challenge, and there was a sense that, maybe you had to realize that you were not just a burden, but that you had skills, that you could run to the mailbox and back what you did, no matter how simple.
And what she brings to this education is a memory of a conversation that she has heard before her departure. Her mother has asked the question. I'm sorry, but thank you. I'll see you next week. Her mother has asked the question, how long will they keep her? To which the father responds, see you, Victor. The father responds, well, they keep her as long as they want to. Now imagine hearing that. What that immediately allows her to hear is, I don't matter. Her father reduces her in synecdoche. He objectifies her as a mouth to feed. She's the oldest, therefore she would eat more. He sees her in relationship to food and to hunger. But the greater hunger, the greater famine is the absence, the famine of parental love and recognition and touch. But he sees her in the second person, you, girl, don't fall in the fire. Yeah. So.
But all of these gestures of, well, I'll call it transformative education.
Yeah. The offices of love?
They are offered with no expectation of favors returned.
Exactly.
There's no expectation of favor
Exactly.
returned. It's not what you and I would consider a contract.
Right.
In which both parties agree, and I do this, you do that, and we're all happy. No, there's no expectation of favor returned.
There is this profound absence of any transaction.
I think there is a scene where it is even said, well, she doesn't have to do anything.
Right. No,
She can just stay here.
in the benign imaginings that occur as she's in the back seat of the car being driven, she wonders if the woman will be a tall woman pouring milk. She wonders if she will have to work. She comes with these expectations, and they're immediately deconstructed. If she wants to help, John says, she can. She learns to clear the spider web. She learns how to use the Hoover. She observes in the kitchen how Edna is very orderly and cuts things up and places everything in its proper place. But you're right, there is no expectation of return whatsoever.
These are not assigned chores.
Precisely. This is charitable love. It's not charity. It's these offices of love These charitable acts are done because someone discerns that there is a need and this individual has the resources to do it. You know, it's done quietly, it's done gracefully, and there's no expectation of compensation. You know, when I think of poverty as it is represented in this novella, there is the economic poverty and hardship that her biological family experiences. But I would argue that the greater poverty in a religious context of poverty is the greatest expression. They give their time. They give their time. And one, you know, that's why poverty is the greatest time. Giving the time is the greatest expression of poverty, because no one can ever give you back your time. And it's done, it's given freely, without any expectation of any compensation. So yes, this is a study in caritas. Indeed. Thank you for mentioning that. Well, I'm sure we are way over time, so thank you. Next week, I promise to talk about re-imaging the prodigal son. Because Dan says, the prodigal child. So I want to work in a discussion. So think about, here's your homework. Think about the meaning of prodigal, prodigality in the context of this novel. When he says, the prodigal child. The mother says, you've grown. And he says, the prodigal child. Growth, prodigality. I want us to look at the Lucan scene of the return of the prodigal son and how in her own way Keegan has embedded that gospel narrative into this narrative. And I said re-images, not reimagining, but re-images the imagery from the novel and of the gospel account. Thank you for staying over. Thank you.